Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is Michelle Benjamin from Leasecake. We're here to talk about 2024 legal trends for franchisees and franchisors. So before we get started, I will just cover a few housekeeping items. We are recording this, and I'll be sending it out to everyone who registered, just in case you feel like listening again in the future or want to share it with someone. And we would love this to be interactive. So if you have any questions at all, at any point, you can use either the chat function or the Q&A function down below and send over your questions, and we'd be happy to answer them. And with that, I will pass it over to Taj.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michelle, for that kind introduction. I don't know, it feels like there's standing room only for this Leasecake Live event. We've got tons of folks from all over the US, and I think even in Canada, that are participating. So without further ado, I do want to introduce our lovely guest today. We are here welcoming an incredible legal eagle who has concentrated her practice in the domestic and international commercial franchise markets, right? General corporate law, franchise consulting, and, ultimately taking people that want to get into the franchise business all the way from the very beginning through the growth of their brand, from a handful of locations to hundreds of locations, and ultimately franchisors that are the top brands today across the US and in international markets. So I would love to welcome Miss Amy Cheng of Cheng Cohen. Amy, welcome to Leasecake Live's webinar.
Thank you, Taj. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I am Taj Adhav. I'm the founder of Leasecake, founded the company about 6 years ago, and we're a real estate and location management platform specifically built for restaurants and service-based retail customers, really of all types. And you could certainly, within the franchise business or even corporate brands as well, use our platform. And we're really excited to share education. It's a big part of what makes us tick, to be very customer-centric and also be a leader in education, making certain everyone in our mix of customers understands the things that are moving in the industry, and certainly law continues to evolve, doesn't it, Amy?
It does. I guess fortunately for lawyers like me, they do continue to evolve.
Absolutely. So let's jump in. I think it's always starts with a good story. So why don't you share yours, where you began and how you got here?
Well, I've had an interesting journey. I was actually born in Taiwan, and I'm the first generation immigrant with my family, my parents, when I was 8 years old, to Tulsa, Oklahoma. I would love to know if anybody listening in is from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I met somebody just yesterday at a conference, I think for the first time in years, that she was from Tulsa, Oklahoma. But obviously a huge change for me as an 8-year-old, going from Taipei, Taiwan to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that's where I lived for the next 10 years. And then from there, I have lived in many different cities. I went to school in Michigan. Went to law school in DC, spent a little bit of time learning and teaching English in Japan, and ended up in Chicago about, I guess, 26, 27 years ago now. So this is now home. It has been my home for a long time. And this is where I have been practicing franchise law.
Okay. And so what inspired you to get into franchise?
Well, let's say this is not a sexy answer, but student loan is what inspired me to get into franchising. So no, seriously, I graduated from law school knowing that I wanted to be a transactional lawyer. I wanted to be working with business people. I enjoy the business aspect of the law. And so I knew that I did not want to be a litigator. I really didn't have any desire to be in court. So I was seeking a position where I could practice commercial transactions. And I happened to kind of stumble upon a interview with Lou Rudnick, actually one of the kind of the fathers of franchising, and had a conversation with many members of his team, and learned about franchising really for the first time in my life, right? Here I am, in my late 20s and had no idea what franchising was. Walked out of that interview thinking, well, this is really interesting, right? So that's how I began. I kind of stumbled upon it, and I have, ever since the first day I started practicing law, I have been doing franchising. It's been almost 27 years now, and learn about, I always tell people I've kind of grown up in the franchise industry as a lawyer.
Yeah, good to know. So, who are your customers? Like, it's definitely franchisors, right? They need to be
Definitely
armed.
franchisors. Yes.
Yeah, they need to be armed with the proper conditions, franchise agreements to ensure success, franchise disclosure documents. Is that right?
Right. What I love about franchising is that when people ask me who are my clients, they range from clients that restaurants to fitness to hotels to home services to pet services, right? You really get to learn about so many different types of businesses, and along this journey I have learned about how I grew up in the restaurant industry. My parents own restaurants, so restaurants, okay, I'm familiar with, right? And luckily for me, back in the 90s, like most of franchise concepts, I think, a large percentage of franchise concepts were still restaurants, right? That has changed. It has evolved. Franchising as a method of growth has, people are realizing this is a really good way to grow a concept, right? And so people have kind of latched onto franchising as a way to grow in many different industries, right? Over the last 20, 30 years. So that has enabled us to really learn about those industries.
Yeah, I think you've hit it on the head. It's like an enablement of the American dream, right? You can take this idea and create consistency and standards, and then lo and behold, you can dominate a specific, maybe a small geographic market, a city, and then a region, and then it starts to take hold. But you need incredible talent, right, to build out that entire franchisor kind of business model. So related question then, at what point in time, because in our travels, as we have got deep experience within the restaurant industry, you often find great talented people, great visionaries that say, you know what, I've been running a restaurant of X locations and I'm ready to franchise. I need some expertise. What would you recommend in terms, is it a size question to say we're ready to franchise, or is it a performance operational kind of hurdle that you need to hit? What do you think?
I don't think it's a size. I look at two things when I talk to people about should I franchise, should I not franchise. I think the first is your concept replicable, right? You could have a great concept and you could be a great operator, but if that concept is not easily replicated, then I don't think franchising works, right? I always say that if you could serve the best food in the world, but if your product takes 10, 12, 20 hours and your menu consists of recipes, 80 different recipes from your grandma, well, that's really not a great franchise concept, right? There's too much almost on the menu. How are people going to be able to replicate this? So that's number one. And for operators, I think the second thing is, are you ready to go into the relationship business? Because at the end of the day, franchising is a very different business, right? Whether you're operating a hotel, a restaurant, or a fitness concept, as an operator, you're dealing with consumers. You're dealing with servicing consumers, right? But as a franchisor, your consumers are really your franchisees, right? Your customers are your franchisees. You're now in the relationship business. So that is a hard switch to flip sometimes for a lot of operators. And you either have to be prepared to make that change, or you have to have people on your team who are going to be able to do that for you, right? There are successful franchisors who remain operators, and they know that that's their passion, but they're able to bring on a team of people who can help them grow the brand. So you need, as far as human resources, you need to make sure that you have that. It's inevitably not going to be a success, unfortunately, if you come and tell me that I own 10 restaurants and I expect to be in charge of franchising. Well, there's so many hours in the day, right? You can't possibly do both jobs successfully if your intention is to grow the franchising aspect of your business.
Yes. Yeah. That makes a great deal of sense. I've heard the the story of, you can kind of look at unit counts as one measure of success, but if you can't scale your people, and your market, right, having 5 locations in a certain DMA, the only way to really measure success is get a little bit further out, and how do you manage and run that, and then lo and behold, once you start to see something that's replicable, that's when they should probably pick the phone up and ask for your thoughts or advice.
Right.
But that's good to know. That's great. All right, so franchise law, I mean, it's been around for how long, right? Because of the FTC, I think, right? So what is it? What does it all entail?
Well, franchise law, really, you start with the FTC rule, which anyone, I don't know, most of you in franchising have heard of, which is the federal law that governs franchising. And it is pursuant to the FTC rule that we draft the franchise disclosure document. So every franchisor should have a franchise disclosure document, right? I'm sure all of your clients, if they're franchisors or they're franchisees, your business involves looking at a franchise disclosure document. So that's the FTC rule. And then there are, in the US, 14 states that also have franchise laws. So when we help a franchisor roll out a franchise program, to the extent that they're going to every single state or any of these states, we would have to comply and have the franchisor be registered to sell franchises in each one of these states. And not only is there a one-time initial process, but unfortunately, the franchise laws require you to continue to update the franchise disclosure document, the FDD, when there are any material changes to the franchisor, the franchise system, the information that's in the FDD. And you also need to make these updates at least once a year. So typically, within 90 to 120 days after the fiscal year end, depending on where the franchisor is selling franchises, we would need to update the FDD.
And then the question becomes, what is material? It's right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And what's important, I think, for all franchisors and franchisees to know that, what is, when the client asks us, is this really material? Like, what's a material change? When do we have to update the FDD? So under the FTC rule, materiality is kind of determined from the eyes of the prospective franchisee, right? So the question is not, is this material to the franchisor, this change? The question is, if I were a prospective franchisee, would I think this was material? So from that perspective, then I think a lot more things, unfortunately, become material.
Sure. Yeah. Through the ongoing operations of, a specific, let's say, large multi-unit operator, how often would they refer to an FDD or a franchise agreement?
Well, I always say the most successful franchisors and franchisees sign that franchise agreement, they put it in the drawer and they never look at it again. So, while the franchise agreement is kind of the foundation of the relationship, you need the franchise agreement because that is the contract that creates the relationship between the franchisor and franchisee, right? It grants the right for the franchisee to be able to use the mark in the system, the right to operate, and the obligation to the franchisor to pay royalties, right? And comply with the system standards. However, once you have reviewed it, once you have signed it, well, the relationship should be hopefully based on trust, right? And a relationship that doesn't require the parties to continue to go back to the franchise agreement. I mean, if you're going back to the franchise agreement, every month to see what your rights or your obligations are, you probably have an issue that we need to talk about.
Yes, for sure. So in the spirit of making this, open and collaborative, and we're fielding questions live throughout this webinar. And so a question that came in, which was, what's the importance of having a coterminous date, meaning the franchise agreement expiration on the same date or prior to the lease expiring? What are the risks and challenges maybe franchisors should be aware of?
That's a really good question. The reality I can say is that most franchise agreements and leases are not coterminous. And the reason being that people typically sign a franchise agreement when they're ready to go. Let's say if it's a restaurant, they're ready to go and look for a location, they're ready to go for sign a lease, right? Well, as a franchisor, you're probably not going to spend a whole lot of time helping the franchisee look for a site, approve the lease, right? Until the franchisee has made the commitment to buy the franchise. So from a process and timing perspective, I would say most franchisees are signing the franchise agreement before they sign the lease, okay? I would say the exception probably is if you're a multi-unit developer and you have signed a development agreement to operate 20 locations and you have a certain territory, maybe, and you already have a binding kind of development agreement. Under those circumstances, maybe it will be easier for the agreement and the lease to be coterminous, okay? But that aside, let's just think about a single unit operator. I go in, I sign a franchise agreement, I go find a location to get approved. It may be a couple months, it may be 6 months until you find a lease and you sign a lease, right? So if the agreement is, let's say, 5 years or 10 years, it's unlikely that the landlord is going to say, okay, well, I'm going to make this lease 4 years and 6 months, right? Pretty unlikely, right? Most likely, it's going to be 5 or it's going to be 10 years. And that's why it's pretty unusual, I think, for the agreements to be coterminous. Now, typically in most franchise agreements, there is a renewal option under the franchise agreement, so that, let's say if your agreement is only 5 years, but you have to sign a 10-year lease, right? As a franchisee, you probably want to make sure that your franchise agreement has at least one renewal option for another 5 years. So, and that's typically so long as the franchisee is in compliance with the agreement. After 5 years, you would have an option to renew the agreement again. Okay,
and
so
what's fascinating about this, we're not really even covering law. We're just talking about dates and dollars and documents.
Well, and that's why Leasecake is so important, actually, because when I look at a system and talk to a system, let's say you want to go in and you want to buy a system, a franchise system. It's really important to know, if you have 100 franchisees, when do the franchise agreements expire? When do the leases expire, right? If you're buying a system where you know that you may have franchise agreements that don't expire until 8 years from now, right? You got franchisees, most of them locked up for at least 8 to 10 years, but you have leases all expiring in the next 2 years. What does that mean? Because as as we just talked about, the terms are usually not coterminous, right? So when you're evaluating a franchise system, I think it's important to look at those dates and to understand what that, from a business perspective. From a legal perspective, you may have signed franchise agreement for the next 20 years, but from a business perspective, what does that mean?
Yeah. So when you talked about, franchisors being in the relationship business, the customers, the franchisee, 100% for sure. And, the best agreement is the one that just sits in a drawer, or the best lease is the one that sits in a drawer. You never have to look at it for 10 years. The challenge is you do, and you need to kind of surface it in a way that people can get faster access to the information that matters, because there may not be an issue, but you need to have a knowledge.
Well,
right? And,
exactly. And
yeah.
even if there's not an issue, you still need those documents, which is why it's so important to know what's in the documents and to be able to use to know when the important dates are, and to be able to access the information. Because again, back to when you're ready to either sell the system or buy a system, right? The information that you're going to need to have on hand, it needs to be there. The last thing you want is to have to spend 6 months trying to figure out and pay somebody like us to try to figure out when all the leases expire, when the franchisees agreements expire, and all that. So having a system in place is extremely helpful. And notwithstanding my goal of having to never look at a franchise agreement once it's signed, I can tell you, unfortunately, we do look at it all the time. We look at leases all the time because something will come up if a franchisor wants to roll out a new system, for example, and wants to understand what the franchisee's lease obligations are. And we have to look at those, even if it's not in relation to, for the purpose of resolving a dispute, which is what we hope that does not happen, right? But as you're running your business, information about what is there and what are the franchisees' rights and obligations are extremely important.
Yeah, and we've seen this time and again, with franchisors that are wanting to make certain that their documents are in order. So having the franchisees' leases in a system, having the franchise agreements in a system, that all those dates are coterminous. I think that there's definitely a trend in the market to say, hey, you know what, we live in an age of immediacy. We got to have fast answers to the stuff that matters. And like you said, it's not that there's any contention, but there's risk. And the risk of not knowing, and the risk of missing something, and having your top franchisee face some, perilous condition, whether it's the landlord or some other thing, can jeopardize your royalties. So I think you're right. It's the smart franchisors are saying, we need a system. We need to put all this into one place that our entire team gets access to it. So there's harmony across all the moving parts. Because the more locations you have, the more complex your life becomes, right? And then you're talking about lost sleep. So you touched on the support system of a franchisor as it grows, whether it's through consolidation, large multi-unit operators, or even corporate is shedding some of their corporate stores or corporate restaurants or acquiring them. Let's move into M&A and due diligence. So whether it's acquisitions or selling, what advice can you provide? I think this is a pretty, lengthy topic. I think we get some questions coming in too. So why don't you just go ahead and start?
This is a pretty lengthy topic. In fact, I just spoke at a conference yesterday about how legal compliance can enhance the value of your franchise system in the event of a future transaction. So I think that's exactly what this question is making sure, how do you put your franchise system in the best place so that if there is a transaction, if the franchisor is going to sell the system 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that you're not going to spend 6 months having to clean it up, right? Having the documents in place, having the systems in place. And it really starts with I mean, the number one bullet point I had yesterday in my session was document retention. It is particularly, I think, because of just technology. People have different expectations now than they had 20 years ago. They just do. They expect you to have the information at your fingertips. When we're doing due diligence on a franchise company on behalf of a private equity making an acquisition, right? We will provide a due diligence list that requires franchisor to upload a significant amount of information, and you need to be able to do that. That people get franchise agreements signed by DocuSign, otherwise, other electronic Acrobat systems. And once it's signed, the question is, how are you storing that? I still have clients, very large, sophisticated clients, that have signed agreements and they send it to somebody via email, and somehow it's like lost somewhere. 6 years later, like, where is that agreement? And we'll be missing, like literally missing franchise agreements. Forget leases. I mean, in my perfect world, I would love to have leases for every one of the franchisees, right? Uploaded, as well as the franchise agreements and any other related documents.
We can help with that.
Right. The other thing that people often forget, the importance of insurance certificates, for example. Making sure that every one of your franchisee has up-to-date insurance, and they have named the franchisor as an additional insured. That will significantly reduce the risk of potential liability for a franchisor, right? To make sure that if something happens at the franchise location and the franchisor gets sued, that the franchisee's insurance will cover the franchisor as an additional insured. So making sure that franchisees are submitting those certificates, reviewing those certificates, so important. And that is something that if you don't start doing when your system is small, by the time you get to 1,000 units, it is virtually impossible to keep up with it. Number one, you don't have a system, a process in place to upload and track that information. And number two, your franchisees are not used to submitting that information. I can promise you that if you have 2,000 franchisees and they're not used to submitting their insurance certificates every single year, and if you send out a notice saying, we require you to start submitting this, the compliance is going to be virtually impossible to ensure that 100% of your franchisees are complying with it. They're not used to it. And you're going to be hiring a whole entire team of people just to have that compliance. Okay. So putting those systems in place, having the documents to be able to know what is in the system is so important when you're thinking about the potential selling of company, and if you're somebody acquiring the company, these are all documents that you want to make sure that they have, number one, and number two, that they have a process to continue to maintain and update.
Yeah. Well, this is reaffirmed by a conversation I had about a couple of hours ago related to, key dates. I mean, you're talking about a $500 million brand with thousands of locations. And the scratching of heads saying, I can't believe we don't have a system to track all of the key dates. I mean, open dates, contractual dates for SDAs or ADAs, managing that. I mean, just really ensuring success of the entire system. So I think you kind of captured it the right way. It's like the overall health of a franchisor brand, it needs to make certain that everything's in order. So, I think one of the things that I learned from my mom, we're in the Leasecake kitchen right now. This is not a backdrop. This is a real live kitchen. But when you're in the kitchen and you're entertaining, you're having a dinner event, there's this phrase that's called clean as you go, right? Clean as you go. So you have this mountain of dishes in your sink. Well, guess what? There are mountains of messes at many franchisors, and it's like that's what they need to get ahead of. So it's pretty telling that when you talk about M&A, when you talk about getting your house in order, you just need a system. So, here's what we do on behalf of our customers that are acquiring or disposing of their locations. It's almost like it's a data room. It's a real estate and location management data room that allows them to say, hey, here's the entire chain of real estate leases and addendums and changes and transitions and transfers, all the way back. So making certain that chain is there, because you never know. I mean, you could have a personal guarantee from an operator, that was 5 years ago, and they don't know that they're still a guarantor on that lease.
That's right. That's
transaction.
right. That's right. Well, and
It's
you would be surprised how the health of kind of the document maintenance system of a franchise company, how it correlates with the health of the rest of the system as a whole. Because
Yeah.
typically when a franchisor has a good process in place to retain the documents, the franchisor probably also has a good process in place for inspections, reporting from franchisees, right? Reviewing those reports, getting those reports, probably have a good system to document communications. That's another area where I think is extremely important for a franchisor to be able to, how do you document communications with franchisees, especially in this age of technology when people are using not only email, right? Text messages, other applications to communicate. How do you keep track of all those communications? That's extremely important because, again, franchise systems go through different ownership. This is not like 40 years ago when a franchisor is a founding franchisor will literally have the franchise system forever, right? In this day and age, there are so many owners that are private equity owners, right? That are other investors that buy franchise companies with the eventual goal of selling this company. So when there is a transition, when there's a sale, how is the new owner going to be able to know what it bought? Which means, right? And you've got franchise executives that go from brand to brand these days, right? This is no longer the age of where you, kind of like people always say our age will go and stay at a company for 50 years, right? That is not typical anymore. So when you have so many people transitioning from company to company, what does that mean? We could have a franchisee executive who come in. I work with companies now that have a whole entire different executive team than when 5 years ago. So I maybe have represented the company for the last 20 years, but we've seen like just so many different executive teams go through, and the current team really has no idea what the process was like 10 years ago, how they communicated with franchisees. So how do you document all that to show the consistency, number one? And if there is an issue, how do you know what happened?
Yeah. Well, it's a very fascinating world, because in the apps that our customers have for their end consumers, you can see all your ordering history, you can see the time of your booking, how much you spent.
Right.
And when it comes to something as vital as real estate and location management, you've got to have a system where there is quick access to those things that matter, maybe decisions from 2 years ago, or rates or critical clauses from 5 years ago, or last Tuesday. So, as it relates to franchise agreements, we touched on that. Tracking your dates, absolutely, right? We're a real estate location management platform. Knowing what those start dates are and those end dates are. When I founded the company, it was more about, certainly every great location starts with a real estate lease, and renewal options are certainly the worst thing that could ever happen if you miss that option, not only for the franchisee, but for the franchisor.
The franchisor.
We see this unfortunately so often, where if the top producing or the highest revenue generating franchisee loses track of a renewal, it impacts the top line revenue of the franchisor. So having that full visibility, know what the deadlines are, but then you take it one step further and you say, hey, franchise agreement expired before the lease renewed, or the lease expiration happened before the franchise agreement, there's every right that the landlord can kick you out. And that again jeopardizes the top line revenue. Then you take it one step further. This is where the location management matters. Things like liquor licenses, right? For any franchise that's in the business of beer and wine or spirits, liquor licenses are a vital component of revenue, right? And is permit, et cetera. So it's just, there's this whole chain of every critical date, dollar, and document need to be accessible on it, anywhere, anytime, and on any device, because we're such a mobile world, right? That's why our consumers, our restaurant customers, have a mobile app, and I can order from that restaurant across the street right now, just 2 clicks of a button. Well, with an easy to use system, I think it's really important to have that all harmonious.
Yeah, and that's particularly true again in this day and age when there's so much change that goes on.
Yeah.
And ownership changes. There are also changes in franchisee ownership too. We've been talking about franchisor system changes, right? Think about the number of transfers that take place within the franchise system. I mean, and from that perspective, the documentation you're talking about is also extremely important to know that when you've got a multi-unit franchisee selling 10 units, what does that mean? What are the documents involved?
Yeah.
What type of locations?
Yeah, and our franchisor customers, so we've got so many of them that are on this bandwagon of creating a support system with everything that you just talked about that enables their franchisees to succeed, but it also provides incredible value to the franchisor because there is a system of record and you can help consistency with, let's face it, everybody, may leave or get promoted or let's say win the lottery. And then, just having something that you can rely on and not have to like read, 20 pages of an SOP or try to figure it out after 6 months. Where do these documents live? Where do these dates live? What's the tracking? I mean, just, going back to that call I had a couple hours ago, $500 million brand saying, I can't believe we don't know our dates. So, and it's so funny because it kind of goes back to, it's not really a legal issue. It's just a date, but those dates are buried in really complex legal stuff that you're such an expert at.
Yeah. I mean, it's while most people think it's not a legal issue, at the end of the day, I think it is, just like the issues I'm talking about in terms of what makes a franchise system more valuable, right? You wouldn't think that legal has anything to do with it. You wouldn't think that dates would have anything to do with it, but
that's true.
They do. It is a very important part of it because only with the information can you assess the health of a system. It provides you with the tools. Without that information, we really don't know when we go in and do due diligence on a company what the state of the company, right? Not only in terms of documentation, but how long the business is going to be there. Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of topics, and now we're going to go on to negotiating tips. Every attorney that we've ever worked with always has some negotiating strategies or tips. What would you offer?
I think the first negotiation tip in terms of when I look at franchising, franchisors and franchisees, is to know what is there. I know that sounds a bit silly, but we just talked about the FDD, right? What have you read? It starts with reading that FDD, whether you're a franchisee or a franchisor. All of the obligations in, between the two parties are set forth in the franchise agreement. And you would be amazed at the number of people who will sign a franchise agreement and have never read it. you probably have dealt with, how many people do you know have signed leases and guaranteed leases without having read it, right?
They go like this and they sign it, and I hope everything's going to be okay.
Right. The funny thing is, I totally understand. While I'm a lawyer, I read contracts, right, all day long. When it comes to signing my own, do I read it? I have to remind myself, maybe I should read that before I sign my name, right? It's very easy to do, but I say my first negotiation tip is understanding kind of what is there, because there have been so many times where people have come to me and said, well, I want this. I'm like, well, it's already in there. But when it comes to leases in particular, there is something I want to point out, that one of the biggest complaints I get from franchisors is that the franchisees go about negotiating leases and they're basically at the finish line. I mean, they've been negotiating this 50-page lease for the last 2 months, right? And it's like the day before signing, they realize, oh, the franchisor requires this lease writer that I have to get the landlord to sign. Landlords are not particularly happy to negotiate leases to begin with. But when they have spent the last couple months negotiating a lease with you, and at the very last minute, you pull out this lease writer that's required by the franchisor, they're not going to be happy. So in terms of looking at negotiating leases, I would encourage all the franchisees who are listening to make sure that they understand what their obligations are to the franchisor with respect to the lease, and get that lease writer in front of the landlord to get that signed, so that they're not holding up that process.
Yeah, that makes a bunch of sense. It's like there's no such thing as over communicating. Right?
No, there's not. And part of it, I think, it's also the fault of many franchisors, because they're not communicating effectively the importance of these lease writer. They're not communicating effectively the requirements under the franchise agreement. Again, my hope is that people sign the franchise agreement and never read it, right? Well, my other hope is that people actually read it and don't have to look it up because they know what's required.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to trends. I mean, again, this is another topic that can be rather vast.
Yeah.
What's going on in the world out there?
What's going on in the world? I don't think I could leave a session that talks about legal trends in 2024 without at least mentioning joint employer liability. It is a topic that everyone is super sensitive to right now. I have had people call me actually and say, should I shut down my franchise business? Or as a new franchisor, a potential franchisor, should I not even consider franchising anymore? So for those of you listening, I don't think franchising is going to go away because of joint employer liability. I certainly hope not. It will require educating the executive team, educating the support staff to the franchisees, educating the marketing team. So that's where I think it all starts right now, is making sure that the franchisor is educating everyone regarding joint employer liability, because unfortunately, franchisees, lawyers understand and are sensitive to the issue as well. So I do see more and more franchisors being named in lawsuits relating to employees of franchisees, right? So this potential exposure is out there, but I think the best way to minimize it is to educate everyone as to how to minimize it. There are a lot of ways that a franchisor can continue to support franchisees through either using third parties, by disseminating information themselves. There are ways to support franchisees without overstepping that line, right? So I think franchisors just need to continue to be sensitive to the issue The best way to do it is to make sure that each one of the employees or the franchisors speaking with franchisees, educating the franchisees, supporting the franchisee, right? Understand how to do it without stepping over that line.
Yeah. Yeah. And so a question that just came in, and actually we're transitioning to it, is like, how do you stay up to date with all of these changes? You know, is there just read the news, or how do you get involved?
Well, here's why I think, Paul Rocchio, if you're listening, I'm putting in a plug for the IFA right now. I really think the IFA is a great resource. We have been members of the IFA ever since we started Cheng Cohen, and I've been very involved in kind of part of my giving back is to make sure that I'm supporting new suppliers, new franchisors, new franchisees, right, through the IFA and doing educational sessions through the IFA. The IFA has just a lot of resources on their website, for example, and I don't think there's a day that I don't come in and check my email and there's some email with some update regarding changes in the law. And their updates are because they're sensitive to the fact that franchisees and franchisors all over the country, right? They really do say a great job staying up to date on the various changes in all states. So that's where I would start. And then I think the second is continuing to participate in webinars like this. I mean, in going to sessions and going to conferences and staying connected to the franchise industry.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, one of our listeners had posted the ABA forum is potentially another resource too. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Amy.
Yes. The ABA, the American Bar Association Forum
Yes.
on Franchising, is also a great legal resource for everyone. And if you're a lawyer and you practice in this area, there is absolutely no excuse, I think, for you not to be part of that Forum on Franchising, because again, we get newsletters. There are books that come out that are published by the forum. The forum has, if not monthly, quarterly webinars on various different topics. So it's a great way to stay in touch.
Wonderful. Yeah. So again, there's probably another session on, what does this mean? But you're right. It's like, get involved, make certain that you're plugged into the changes, because, the American dream's at stake. And, it's not going to go away simply because of these laws, but it's important to make certain that there's some pressure.
Yeah. And a lot of law firms, like I know our law firm, we put out newsletters and we always update content on our website with any changes that we're aware of. We'll push out content through our website as well. And people will subscribe to our newsletter, and I'm sure most law firms have this. You can subscribe to their websites and get newsletters. That's
great. Well, appreciate everybody's questions coming in. Let's talk about another really big change, which is AI. I know our customers are enjoying the benefits of it, through our platform, but I'm curious, has it impacted your business in any way, or not yet?
I would say not significantly yet, but it definitely is starting to. I don't think anybody can operate a business at this point without understanding the impact that AI has on franchising. And so it is important to stay up to date. And it is going to, my suspicion is that at some point it will more significantly impact the practice of law than it has. Right now, I would say there's not a huge impact, just because as lawyers, we can't really rely on AI to write a brief. But from the business perspective, I know that AI had a huge impact on operations, on marketing. I mean, people are using it to educate and using it really effectively.
Yeah, that's good to know. The term I've heard, it's like AI will not take away your jobs, but the ones that know AI better than you may do so.
Yes,
So you got to,
I think that's right.
yeah, absolutely. All right. Advice. I know we covered a ton of different advice, but like in a nutshell, here's we're wrapping up, and some more questions are coming in too. So take it away.
Advice for franchisors. Just, I would say, remember, we've been talking most of the session about documentation and about having a process, right? At the end of the day, I mean, that is, we can't forget about the documentation. We can't forget about having the processes in place. But at the end of the day, franchising is a relationship. If I have any advice to give people, is to remember that. You can't treat every franchisee the same, right? You can't, every system is different. And a lot of kind of how we deal with our clients is understanding the culture of their system, understanding what are the important points, right? What are some of the things that the messaging for the system, okay? Because when we give, whether we're giving legal advice, business advice, we're helping a franchisor and franchisee sort out the relationship, we're helping a franchisor roll out a system, a lot of it will come down to the culture of the system. We start there. And then we have to understand, okay, this is from a culture perspective, this is how we're going to accomplish our goal, right? And from a legal perspective, can we do that? But I think legal is always has to be the second. The first has to be, how does the franchisor want to do it? And what are they comfortable? How are they comfortable to do it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a culture of support. It's a culture of communication. It's a culture of relationships, which breeds a culture of success.
Well, and at this conference I was at yesterday, someone was talking about development process and finding the right franchisees, right? And at the end of the day, you could have the franchisee with the perfect experience. You could have a franchisee with millions of dollars, financially qualified. But if that franchisee is not a cultural fit, everyone in the room agreed that it's not going to work. So I think that same message, I would say, if you want to have a successful relationship and not have to constantly pull out that franchise agreement to figure out what can you make this franchisee do, you got to have that cultural fit, and you got to start there.
Yeah, because it's all you're growing the family, right? Yep. And they've got to be able to fit, and transparency is going to be important, and growth. So that makes sense. Well, you've been giving a ton of advice. Truly appreciate it. Now, what's the best advice you've ever heard or received?
No, the best advice I think I have received is through watching, and it's from my parents, which I think is leading by example. It's a way my parents always ran a business, and that's how I like to run our business. And I think the most successful franchisors do the same. You can't ask somebody to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. And if we're talking about franchising, I think that is extremely important. As a franchisor, I always ask my client, is this something that you would do, what you're asking your franchisees to do, right? As an employer, is this what you would do? So, so when I'm making changes, whether it's in my business or helping a client make changes to their business, that's the question I always ask.
Sure. I thought you were going to say the best advice I ever received was like, Amy, get into law.
No, you know what? That was the one advice I never received from my parents. Believe it or not. Believe it or not.
That's hilarious. All right. So there's a few more questions coming in, but I think the most important was like, hey, how do we get in touch with you? So what's your email?
My email is amy.cheng@chengcohen.com. The easiest way is just probably go on our website and you'll find me there.
Sounds good. Well, I've known you for probably what, 4 or 5 years now. It's been a wonderful relationship. And again, bringing these thought leaders together in ways that can educate the market, ideally, whether it's franchise systems or corporate. We have an upcoming Leasecake Live webinar series that continues. So navigating lease acquisitions with effective and efficient due diligence, that's coming up next week. In a few more weeks, restaurant financial success, a very large franchise of pretty well-known brands, but tune in for that one. I think you'll find that very fascinating, this gentleman's journey, Scott Miller, CFO, as well as efficiency on a very, very large Little Caesars franchisee that's expanding into markets that we're so proud to be a part of. So we look forward to having you all join us. Amy, it has been just such a pleasure to hear your gems and your pearls of wisdom being shared. Always loved the conversations we have one-on-one, whether it's over a beer or a glass of wine and seeing at these events. But thank you very much for being a part of this.
Thank you very much for having me, Dodge.
You're welcome. All right. Well, listen, we'll sign off, and this recording will be available for everyone that's registered and attended, and we'll make certain to get the content out. But thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.